The morning sun cast golden trails along the shoreline, just the way I remembered it as a child. Salt and sea breeze danced together in the wind as if they were welcoming me back after all these years. The rhythm of the waves had not changed, but everything else had. It had been almost 3 decades since I walked barefoot on this beach, my beach. Back then, it was all wild seagrass, weathered docks, and freedom. Now it stood hemmed in by tightly packed homes, wooden signs reading Private HOA Beach, and overly landscaped pathways that looked like they belonged in a resort rather than the quiet coastal town I grew up in. My grandfather had passed it down to my father, who left it to me. But after I moved away for school, the beach became a forgotten memory in the backdrop of corporate life, boardrooms, and broken dreams, until I lost everything and came home after the company I co-founded went under due to one partner's reckless spending. I needed a reset. I was tired, not just from the lawsuits or bankruptcy or the sleepless nights, but from carrying the weight of proving myself to a world that only applauded the results and never the effort. I was a man who had chased dreams, climbed ladders, and now stood back at the edge of something deeper than the sea. I had sold nearly everything in the city, keeping only one thing: the deed to this forgotten stretch of sand, hidden in the county's oldest records and untouched by HOA lines that had grown around it like ivy around a tree. So I packed my truck, left behind the high-rise chaos of a failed legacy, and came here to rebuild from the earth, or rather, the shore up. I set up a modest prefab cabin on the edge of the dunes, intentionally blending it with the landscape. It was nothing fancy, just wood, steel, and sweat. My days were filled with repairs, clearing old paths, replanting native bushes, and listening to gulls cry overhead like they were reminding me that I belonged here. But peace has a price, and I was about to pay it. Her name was Karen. I first saw her the day I rebuilt the old boat dock that had collapsed 20 years ago. She stood on the edge of her pristine white deck, hands on hips, oversized sunglasses pushing back a bleached bob of hair that defied wind logic. Her presence did not blend into nature. It declared itself like a marching band in a monastery. You can't build that there. She barked across the breeze, voice shrill enough to pierce through the sound of my hammer. That violates our HOA guidelines. I wiped my forehead, laid down the tool, and responded calmly. "Ma'am, I'm not in the HOA." She laughed. A short, sharp sound like a hiccup trying to be important. "Everything along this coast is HOA now. You're in it by default if you're living here." I smiled, half out of politeness, half out of disbelief. That might be true for newer properties, but this one's been in my family for 3 generations. It's on its own parcel. It was never part of any HOA. I can show you the deed if you like. Her face scrunched like I had spoken ancient Greek. She took a step closer, still on her property line, but looking like she was measuring every inch of mine with imaginary rules. "This land has rules, sir. We've worked hard to keep this neighborhood clean and orderly. Random cabins and amateur docks don't belong here. If you're living here, you follow our policies." I kept my tone steady, though irritation rose slowly in my chest like the tide. "And I've worked hard to build a home on land that belongs to me. I respect your rules, Karen, but they don't apply to me." Her mouth opened slightly, as if she was about to argue more, but her eyes flashed with something deeper, the knowledge that she could not control me. And to someone like her, that was unforgivable. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next week, I received a letter in a plastic-sealed envelope stapled to my wooden gate. "Cease unauthorized construction. HOA violation notice." There were photocopies of supposed HOA rules, pages marked with highlighter and angry underlines in red ink. At the bottom, it warned of escalating fines and mandatory compliance reviews. I shook my head. It would have been funny if it were, not so invasive. I marched over to her house, letter in hand. She met me at the porch like she had been waiting. "This is meaningless," I said, holding the letter out to her. "I'm not under your authority." She didn't take the paper. "I spoke to the HOA board. They agree that Doc has to go. Spoke to the county. They confirmed what I already knew. My land predates your HOA by over 50 years. I don't answer to your board." Her lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "We'll see about that." And just like that, a cold war began on the sand. Every time I cleared brush, she called code enforcement. Every time I parked my truck, she took pictures and emailed someone. When I hosted my cousin's kids for a beach bonfire one evening, she called the sheriff, claiming we were trespassing and causing a public disturbance. The deputy showed up, recognized me, and laughed when I showed him the deed. Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed, lips trembling in rage that no law could back her claim. She was not seeking justice. She was seeking power, and she could not stand that my mere existence on land I owned defied her imagined control. But I did not break. I refused to move. Every nail I hammered, every board I laid, was a silent act of defiance. This beach was my inheritance, not just from my family, but from the version of myself that refused to let bitterness take root. And strangely, through every insult, every false claim, every sideways glance from her gossiping neighbors, I felt more alive than I had in years. One afternoon, I found my dock's sabotaged ropes cut, planks loosened. No cameras, no witnesses, just Karen's eyes watching from behind half-drawn blinds. I filed a report quietly. I had no proof, but I knew. She had gone from yelling to striking in silence. And still, I stayed. Because people like her only win when you walk away. Then came the town meeting. That night changed everything. Asterisk. The town meeting was supposed to be routine and agenda of pothole repairs, beach cleanup schedules, and summer festival announcements. But the moment I stepped into that old municipal hall, I knew it was going to turn into something else. The room buzzed with idle chatter, the kind of forced politeness that small communities perfected over years of subtle warfare disguised as neighborly concern. Folded chairs lined the room in neat rows, with the town council seated on an elevated platform up front, and sitting front and center like a queen prepared to make her decree, was Karen. Her smile was tight, rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting all week for this very moment. I sat toward the back, nodding politely at a few older folks who recognized me as Don Shaw's boy. My father's name still carried weight in this town. I had barely settled into my seat when Karen stood and, without waiting for her turn, raised her voice. "Before we move on," she announced, her voice louder than necessary, "I would like to bring to attention an issue that's been ignored for far too long. It concerns a property on the south end of the beachland that, until recently, was neglected but has now become a hub of unregulated activity." I exhaled slowly. So this was her stage, her theater, and I was her unwelcome plot twist. Ms. Cartwright, one of the council members, said, trying to maintain the usual order, "If you're referring to the coastal parcel, I am." She interrupted, adjusting her pearl necklace like it gave her legal authority. "That land has become a nuisance. The new structure being built there doesn't conform to HOA visual standards. There's been frequent noise, bonfires, children running wild. This is a residential beach, not a campground." There were murmurs in the room. Some curious, some annoyed, but most simply waiting to be entertained. I stood up slowly. I had not planned to speak, but she had made it impossible not to. "My name is Jason Shaw," I said clearly, walking toward the front. Karen's face tensed, as if she had bitten into a lemon she had hoped was sweet. "And that land is mine. It's been in my family for 3 generations. It is not now, nor has it ever been, part of any HOA jurisdiction. Councilman Reynolds, a man with a thick mustache and thinning hair, looked down at a paper in front. Of him, we did verify the land title. Jason. It's recorded as an independent parcel. Karen, the HOA's governance doesn't extend past lot boundary 113. Mr. Shaw's lot is 111. Karen's voice cut through like a blade. But he's living within our community. He should be expected to uphold the same standards, with all due respect, I said. Facing her directly, standards aren't laws. And your standards do not override ownership. My family didn't. Sign onto your bylaws. This isn't about community harmony. This is about control. You filed false reports, harassed guests, and now you're trying to publicly shame me into surrendering something you never owned. The silence that followed was dense. Everyone knew the tone had shifted. I was not yelling. I was not even emotional. But the calmness in my voice seemed to unsettle her more than rage ever could. Karen tried to laugh it off, addressing the crowd instead of me. I'm only asking for consistency. If we let one person build without oversight, what happens to property values? What happens when someone puts up a billboard or runs a beach business next door? That was her trick, always speaking about the future. The principle, the danger of letting others act freely, was never about policy. It was about her fear of losing control, and everyone knew it. I'm not running a business, I said. I rebuilt a family dock that washed away 20 years ago. I'm living quietly, repairing the land. Planting native trees that HOA landscapers ripped out and replaced with imported bushes that require pesticide runoff into the ocean. So let's talk about who's respecting the land. The mayor, a tired-looking woman with glasses sliding down her nose, finally spoke. Karen, we appreciate your concern, but legally speaking, Mr. Shaw is within his rights. Unless there's a violation of county code, we cannot intervene. Karen sat down stiffly, not defeated, but bruised. Her eyes locked on mine with a silent promise this wasn't over. But I had not come here to fight. I had come to reclaim. And despite the win, it felt like the battle had only just begun. The next day, someone dumped a pile of broken seashells and rusty nails across my driveway. A silent warning. I cleaned it up without a word. Then came the anonymous tips to the health department claims of unsanitary conditions, mold, even illegal waste dumping. Each accusation brought an inspector, and each inspector left with a quiet apology once they saw the truth. It became a ritual. I'd offer them lemonade, show them the solar panels, the compost system, the water reclamation tanks. I had built a sustainable retreat, not a problem. And every time they left, just a bit more impressed. Karen, however, grew angrier with every failure to shut me down. She began knocking on neighbors' doors, rallying them under the pretense of preserving neighborhood order. Some followed, mostly out of boredom or blind loyalty, but others especially. The older ones who had lived through real hardships started coming to me quietly. They apologized for her. One even brought a basket of blueberries from their garden and whispered, "She tried to make us hate you, but you're the only one who's planted anything useful around here in years." The tide was turning. I decided to host a small community, gathering a beach cleanup and picnic for anyone who wanted to help. No political agenda, no speeches, just neighbors coming together. I invited everyone, even Karen, though I knew she would never come. But others did. Families with kids, older couples with stories to share, teens who wanted to surf but had no idea about the trash hidden in the seaweed. We filled dozens of bags with debris, rebuilt a public bench, even cleared a safe swimming zone with flagged markers. People laughed, ate, shared stories. And for a moment, it felt like the beach was ours, not by law, not by title, but by effort. Karen watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. That night, as I sat by the fire pit alone, a soft knock came at my gate. I turned, expecting a neighbor. It was a police cruiser. My chest tightened. The officer stepped out, polite but professional. "Evening, Mr. Shaw. We received a complaint. Something about unauthorized fireworks and dangerous gatherings." I pointed to the fire pit, which had been put out hours ago. The food had been cleaned. The guests long gone. There was nothing but quiet and ocean and a few tiki torches swaying in the wind. "No fireworks," I said plainly. He nodded. "Didn't think so. Just had to check." "You've got a good setup here, by the way. My dad knew your family." This beach was his favorite spot to fish when he was a kid. He tipped his cap and left. Karen was watching from her deck. She didn't wave. She just turned and went inside, her shadow flickering behind the blinds like smoke after a failed fire. But I knew her well enough now to understand something dangerous had ignited inside her. She had tried rules, then gossip, then sabotage. None had worked. The next move, I feared, would be something deeper, something personal. And I was right, because the very next week, Karen filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit arrived not in a knock at the door or a neighbor's whisper, but in a plain white envelope slipped neatly into my mailbox like it was just another piece of junk mail. There was nothing loud or dramatic about it. No confrontation. No warnings. It was quiet, sterile, and cold. The way betrayal often is. I tore open the top, expecting perhaps another HOA letter or some petty notice. But what I found instead made my heart slow and my fingers tighten. Karen Cartwright v. Jason Shaw. A civil complaint filed in county court. The opening line accused me of creating public disturbance, devaluing neighboring property, and violating long-standing residential codes related to community development. She was suing me for emotional distress. She wanted damages. And most shockingly of all, she was demanding I either tear down my home or submit to HOA jurisdiction permanently. For several minutes, I stood still on the porch, eyes scanning the document again and again like it might vanish if I read it one more time. I had expected harassment. I'd expected gossip, sabotage, and even dirty tricks. But this was war disguised in paperwork. It was the kind of thing people did when they could not win through reason or reputation. They filed, they twisted. They tried to bleed you out through fees and fear and formality. She knew what she was doing. Karen had connections, money, and time. She wanted to drown me in legal mud, force me to either bend to her will or waste my resources fighting back. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin's single-room living area, the tide whispering outside the windows. My father's old law books spread out across the table. He had been a quiet man, not the type to seek fights, but he believed deeply in protecting what was rightfully yours. I remembered the day he told me about the beach. I was maybe 12. He handed me the old deed with my name handwritten at the bottom in permanent ink, along with a small note. "Someday, this will be yours. Take care of it and never sell it." That weight returned to me now, not just in memory, but in responsibility. I could not give in. I would not. The next morning, I drove into town and hired the best local attorney I could find, a woman named Celia Mathers. She was sharp, mid-40s, with dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun and eyes that looked like they had stared down judges and won. She listened patiently as I laid everything out from Karen's letters and sabotage to the endless false reports and the town meeting drama. When I handed her the lawsuit, she flipped through it once, then looked up at me. "She's bluffing." "On half of this," Celia said. "But she's smart. This isn't about winning in court. This is about dragging you through it until you're exhausted." I nodded. "She thinks if she can't scare me off with rules, she can break me with red tape." She's underestimated the wrong man. For weeks, we prepared our defense. Celia filed a counterclaim, submitted evidence, and gathered witness statements. I dug up every piece of land documentation my family ever saved, including a notarized affidavit from my grandfather confirming the independent nature of the property. But Karen, as always, was relentless. She doubled down, hosting HOA meetings in her home, handing out flyers accusing me of being a rogue resident who endangered children and disrespected local traditions. She even staged photos of children supposedly tripping over debris on the beach, children I had never seen, and who never set foot near my land. But the storm really broke when she called the local paper. The front page ran a headline: "Unruly beach owner ignites feud with HOA. A talk." The article quoted Karen at length, painting her as a concerned citizen merely protecting the neighborhood from unsanctioned and dangerous development. There was no mention of my legal rights, no interview with me, just her version of events, polished, sensationalized, and crafted to inflame the next morning. I stepped outside to find 3 unfamiliar cars parked by the roadside, and a man with a camera drone hovering above my property line. A young reporter tried to approach me with a microphone, asking, "Is it true you're refusing to comply with basic community safety standards?" I stared at him, calm but firm. "It's true, I'm not part of any HOA, and I'm within every legal right to live on my own land. If you're looking for the story, you might want to ask why a private citizen is being targeted by a woman who thinks a deed means nothing when she does not like the view." The footage aired that evening. This time, the angle shifted slightly. The town began to take sides. Some saw me as a stubborn loner, a holdout from a different time, refusing to play by modern rules. But others saw the truth that Karen's crusade was personal, obsessive, and rooted in ego more than order. The next few days were the hardest. I lost a few potential allies. Neighbors who had quietly supported me stopped waving. A few people moved their beach chairs further down the shore when I walked by. There was a coldness in the air, not because they believed I was wrong, but because they were afraid of her. Karen was not just a nuisance. She had power, influence, and in a small town like ours, sometimes that was enough to bend the truth until it snapped. But then something unexpected happened. One morning, I heard a knock on my gate. It was quiet, hesitant. I opened it to find a woman standing there, elderly, wrapped in a soft shawl, eyes wet with tears. "I just wanted to say," she whispered, "thank you for standing up to her." I blinked. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "No," she said. "But I've lived here since before the HOA existed." Karen made it impossible to enjoy our own gardens, our own porches. She finds people for bird feeders. She yelled at my grandson for skateboarding. "You're the first person who's pushed back. Please don't stop." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She handed me a small envelope with a photo inside, a picture from the 1960s, showing my father and her husband fishing off the very dock I had rebuilt. "This was before they tore it down," she said. "It was a good place back then." I thanked her, my throat tight. She walked away without another word. But from that moment on, I knew the fight was bigger than me. It was not just about a piece of beach. It was about something every community forgets when bureaucracy takes over. That land is not just property. It is memory, family, freedom. Karen wanted order, but what she really craved was submission. And I was done giving an inch. When we appeared in court for the first hearing, I stood straight in my cleanest jeans beside Celia, watching Karen flanked by 2 HOA board members and a lawyer who looked like he had not smiled since the Reagan administration. The judge was an older woman who asked sharp questions and took detailed notes. Celia laid out our case with elegance and facts. She dismantled Karen's claims one by one. No jurisdiction, no damages, no legal right to force me into an HOA. I never joined. And when Karen's lawyer tried to argue community impact, Celia simply held up the original 1927 deed and said, "Impact is not ownership, and Ms. Cartwright has no legal stake in land she did not build, buy, or belong to." By the end of the day, the judge had not made a final ruling, but I saw it in her face. Karen's case was unraveling. Still, Karen smiled as she left, like someone who had not yet played her final card. And that terrified me more than anything. Because when power slips from people like her, they do not surrender. They escalate, and what she did next proved it. The day after our court hearing, the wind along the beach shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift only someone who had lived there long enough could feel. The kind that came not from weather, but from something beneath it, tension rippling, just beneath calm waves. I had walked back from the courthouse with a mix of cautious optimism and steady nerves. Celia, ever the realist, reminded me that while we had dismantled most of Karen's claims, the judge would take time to rule, and in that space of waiting, people like Karen got dangerous. I had heard the warnings before, but it was not until that morning that I fully understood just how far Karen was willing to go. It started with silence. No more fake violations. No police calls. No HOA letters. The beach was unusually quiet, even her deck, which normally served as a throne for her daily watchful stare, sat empty. I should have known something was coming, but when you are constantly defending yourself, sometimes you welcome silence even when it is unnatural. Then came the drone footage. I woke up to a voicemail from a man I had never heard of, someone claiming to be from a social media account called Beach Justice. He sounded too enthusiastic, too polished. His voice had that clickbait tone. "Hey Jason, big fan of what you're doing out there, man. Listen, your neighbor Karen sent us some drone clips, said she caught you illegally dumping trash into the water. If that's not true, you might want to respond quick, because, this is about to go viral." I froze, phone still in hand. I had not dumped a single thing into the ocean. Not once. I recycled everything. I composted. I'd even helped clear debris from the storm last month, something not a single HOA member bothered to assist with. But the idea that Karen had a video, I knew immediately it was fake. Not fabricated in the Hollywood sense, but framed, misrepresented. And that was worse, because the people watching online would not care about context. They would see what she wanted them to see. I opened the link the man had texted me. The video started with a dramatic zoom shot of me wheeling a barrel across the sand. The footage was clearly from her drone. She had likely recorded me dozens of times without consent. The narration was not hers, though. It was a young man, probably the Beach Justice guy, with dramatic music in the background. "Here we see a rogue beach resident," he narrated, ignoring environmental guidelines and rolling what appears to be a barrel of waste directly toward open water. The shot cut to a close-up zoomed and grainy of me lifting the barrel, tipping it forward. Except what the video did not show was that the barrel was filled with oyster shells from a local restaurant's donation, part of a community shoreline reinforcement project I had quietly volunteered for through a marine conservation group. We had a permit. The shells would create a protective reef to reduce erosion, but in the video, none of that context existed. It ended with a slow-motion wave hitting the shore and the narrator saying, "And HOA sources say this is just one of many violations committed by the so-called beach rebel." The video had over 60,000 views by noon, and by sunset it had crossed 200,000. Suddenly, strangers were commenting on my home, my face, my land. Some were supportive, saying things like, "Leave that man alone," and "Power to the property owner." But others were ruthless, calling me a polluter, a menace, even suggesting I be arrested. One post joked about lighting my dock on fire. I sat in my cabin that night, reading hundreds of comments from people, who knew nothing of my life but had already made me a villain in their minds. Karen had played her most dangerous card, the internet. And I was now fighting not just her, but the entire machine of viral outrage. Celia called the next morning, furious. "We'll file for defamation," she said. "False accusation, malicious framing, reputational damage. This is a serious escalation." "But the video's already everywhere," I said. "Even if we win, the damage is done. Then we fight louder." And we did. We gathered evidence, emails, permits, community statements, even video of the Oyster Reef work being done. The Marine group I volunteered with issued a public letter defending my actions, posted it online, and even contacted the news outlet that first ran Karen's footage. But the truth moves slower than lies. And while facts were on our side, perception was still hers. That was when I realized I could not just defend anymore. I had to go on offense, not with anger or manipulation, but with transparency. I invited a local documentary student from the nearby college who had reached out earlier, asking to interview me. I had ignored him then, fearing exposure, but now I welcomed it. "Tell the full story," I told him. "No scripts, just facts. You film everything, good and bad. Let people see the truth." He came the next day, camera in hand, notebook full of questions. Over the next week, he followed me as I worked on the dock, picked up trash, replanted seagrass, explained everything from the history of the beach to Karen's obsession with power. We filmed me showing the deed, reading my grandfather's letter aloud, and walking through the timeline of every false accusation. The student released the video a few days later, titled "The Man Who Owns the Beach and the HOA That Wants to Control It." It started slowly, just a few hundred views. Then a marine conservation account reposted it. Then a local news channel picked it up. By the end of the week, it had over 500,000 views, and the tone had shifted. People were furious, not at me, but at Karen. Suddenly, my inbox filled with support. Letters from veterans who had faced similar HOA battles. Donations to the Conservation Project. Even an offer from a publishing company asking if I had considered writing about my story. And just like that, the tide turned. Not in court, but in the public eye. Karen had weaponized the internet, but I had responded with the truth, and that made her furious. She stormed into my property that weekend, for the first time crossing the invisible line she had always stayed behind. She came right up to my cabin, camera in hand, shouting loud enough for the seagulls to flee. "You made me look like a monster," she screamed. "You edited that video to make me look like a control freak." "I did not edit anything," I said calmly, holding my ground. "You did that all by yourself." She looked around, almost expecting someone to support her, to cheer her on. But no one came. Her allies had gone quiet. The same people she had rallied weeks ago now watched from windows, unsure of whose side was safe anymore. Karen's face twisted into something between rage and despair. "You do not belong here," she spat. "I have belonged here since before you even knew this beach existed." And with that, she stormed off. Later that evening, I found a letter tucked beneath a stone near my fire pit. It was handwritten, shaky. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I let pride blind me. I see now what this land means to you. I see now how wrong I was, Karen. But I did not believe it. Not for a second. Because the next morning, someone had filed a building code complaint with the county, claiming my dock was structurally unsafe and dangerous to children. Karen had not surrendered. She was regrouping, and this time, she was bringing the HOA board with her. By the time the HOA board inserted themselves into the fray, I had already fortified myself against the storm. What had started as Karen's personal crusade was now evolving into a full-blown campaign, waged not just by her, but by the entire HOA's leadership. I could tell she had shifted her strategy. After failing in her personal attacks, failing in the court of public opinion, and failing to shut me down through sabotage, Karen went where all tyrants eventually go. When cornered, she convinced others that the threat was never her fight alone. She made it about neighborhood unity, long-term planning, and protecting future generations. She weaponized language using calm phrases that masked hostile intent. And the board, most of them exhausted from years of minor complaints and endless meetings, followed her lead not because they all agreed, but because it was easier than challenging her. The first board statement came printed in thick black ink on HOA letterhead and was posted on every public bulletin board from the beach entrance to the grocery store. It read like a warning without being one, a public announcement meant to look like policy but dripping with personal disdain. It addressed unregulated coastal construction and expressed serious concern regarding private ownership within community borders, calling for a reassessment of land designations and future compliance alignment. It never mentioned me by name, but it did not have to. Every resident knew exactly who it was about. That same week, I noticed surveyors walking across my property, not county officials. Private contractors hired by the HOA. They carried measuring tape, spoke in clipped tones, and when I approached them, they said they were performing an environmental impact survey on behalf of concerned citizens. When I demanded they leave, one of them tried to hand me a printed notice citing a community safety initiative. I handed it right back, told them the deed was in my name. The land was privately owned, and the only ones with legal authority here were the county or the sheriff. I watched them leave, their silence louder than any argument. But the moment I truly understood how far they were willing to go came days later, when I received a notice informing me that the HOA had petitioned the county to begin the process of eminent domain. They wanted to take the land, the very soil my grandfather had walked, the water my father had swum in, the cabin I had built with my bare hands. They wanted to claim it under the pretense of community interest. Their goal was to have the county seize it and fold it into public common space under HOA management. Karen's dream had evolved from controlling my behavior to erasing my ownership entirely. I remember sitting on the edge of the rebuilt dock that night, watching the waves touch the beams I had sanded, sealed, and bolted myself. The sun dipped low behind the horizon, casting orange flames across the surface, as if the water itself was reflecting back my anger, my fear, and my refusal to bend. The injustice of it all was staggering. Not just the lies or the smear campaigns, but the audacity. That someone who had never lifted a hand to preserve this place now felt entitled to decide its future. Celia came down to meet me that night, her shoes crunching softly over the gravel path. She had grown quieter in recent weeks, her usual courtroom fire giving way to something heavier. The burden of defending truth against a system that did not always reward it. She sat beside me, staring at the sea. "They're trying to outlast you," she said. "They want you to make a mistake, to snap, to react emotionally so they can point and say, 'See, he's the problem.'" I nodded slowly. "And if I don't, they'll keep pushing until the county gives in, or until the court case is so buried in motions and appeals that you run out of money." I smiled bitterly. She doesn't want the land, she just doesn't want me to have it. "That's exactly it," Celia replied. "And unfortunately, people like that rarely stop until something breaks. A system, a person, or a principle." We sat there a long time in silence, but the next morning something strange happened. I awoke to find several brown envelopes tucked between the wooden slats of my gate, handwritten letters. One by one, I opened them. Inside were notes from neighbors, people I barely knew or had assumed were on Karen's side. Each letter contained an apology, a thank you, or a simple note of encouragement. Some wrote about the videos Others wrote about their own struggles with the HOA. A few included old photos of the beach from decades ago, my father's era, when the dock was a communal space and no one charged fees to sit near the water. One letter, written by a man in his 70s, simply read, "Your father would be proud. Stand tall." That was the moment I decided I would no longer just defend, I would lead. I called the same student filmmaker who had helped expose Karen's drone stunt and asked him to meet me again. This time, I brought together the neighbors who had written to me, who had stories, who had suffered. Together, we stood on the beach, each person holding up their letter, telling their truth to the camera. Some cried, some shook with emotion. Others spoke with a clarity they had not found in years. We called it "The Beach Belongs to Memory." And when we released it online, it struck a nerve. Local news picked it up. A regional blog published a piece titled, "When HOAs Go Too Far, The Battle for a Family Shoreline." Donations started flowing again. National news reached out. My inbox flooded with thousands of messages, people from all over the country sharing their own HOA nightmares, their stories of injustice, their desire for someone, anyone, to finally say enough. And most important of all, the county noticed. Within a week, the Office of the Commissioner released a formal statement suspending any discussion of eminent domain on private parcels, unrelated to safety or infrastructure needs. They reminded the public that private ownership, when legally recorded and maintained, was not subject to reclassification without cause. Karen's boldest move had been rejected. Her greatest gamble undone by truth and public pressure. But her pride was not. One evening, as I returned from town, I saw her standing in the sand, alone, facing the waves. She did not look at me as I walked by, and I did not speak to her. For the first time since our battle began, she looked small, not in size, but in spirit. The wind pulled at her cardigan, her arms crossed, her eyes distant. I paused a few feet away. "You had a chance to build something with me," I said, softly. "Instead, you chose to destroy." She turned slowly, her voice hoarse. "I built this community." "No," I said. "You built fences. There's a difference." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Just a look, tired, angry, defeated. And then she walked away, leaving a trail of footprints that the tide would soon erase. But the board was still quiet. And I knew they were not finished. The final court hearing was approaching. The outcome of that decision would decide everything. My dock, my cabin, my right to live in peace without the constant shadow of arbitrary rules. It was no longer just about Karen. It was about precedent, about whether ownership still meant something, about whether a single person could protect a legacy in the face of a machine. Built on fear and fines, the story was nearing its climax. And whatever happened next, I would be ready. The courthouse stood quiet that morning. It's a kind of sacred silence only found in places where lives are dissected and decisions carry the weight of permanence. As I walked through its heavy doors, the rhythm of my boots on the tiled floor seemed to echo louder than ever before. Not with fear, I had faced that long ago, but with certainty. It was the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you have done everything right and still been dragged into battle. That deep resolve that comes when you have been cornered, blamed, lied about, and yet stood your ground while others tried to take it from you. Brick by brick, word by word. The courtroom was already half full by the time I arrived. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her attorney and two of the HOA board members. She wore a perfectly ironed beige suit with a brooch that caught the sunlight and made it glint like a warning. Her hair was curled tighter than ever, her lips pressed into a line that spoke volumes. This was her moment. Her final attempt to claim what she believed was rightfully hers, or at the very least, to ensure that I would suffer for not surrendering. But her posture gave her away. She sat rigid, but not with poise. with control slipping through her hands like dry sand. Across from her, I sat with Celia, who laid out our files with calm precision, her confidence unshaken by the show Karen and the board had prepared. The judge entered, a woman known for her balance and refusal to be swayed by theatrics. Her presence alone seemed to shift the air. Everyone rose, then sat, and the proceedings began. Karen's attorney spoke first. His argument was long, winding, and loaded with legal jargon that tried to sound noble but reeked of desperation. He painted a picture of a peaceful community disrupted by an outsider. Framed me as a rogue landowner who refused to follow the spirit of unity and endangered the collective aesthetic and values of the neighborhood. He presented printouts of HOA regulations, drone photos, and even public comments taken out of context from the earlier social media smear. He spoke about erosion, property values, emotional damage, and referenced the growing discord in the neighborhood, all of which he attributed to me. When he finally sat down, it felt as if he had thrown everything into the air, hoping that even one piece would stick. The judge scribbled a few notes and then nodded to Celia, and that was when the truth began to speak. Celia stood slowly, deliberate and firm, her voice neither loud nor theatrical, just clear, unwavering like a lighthouse in a storm. She began with the land. She presented the deed, the age of the property, the original signatures from my grandfather, and the state. She explained how the parcel had always been private and how the HOA, established decades later, never once held legal sway over it. She provided copies of zoning maps, boundary verifications, and statements from the county's land records office. She walked the court through the timeline: Karen's first confrontation, the false notices, the fabricated drone video, the police calls, the community letter, and finally the coordinated effort to file a civil complaint not rooted in law but in personal vendetta. When she finished laying out the documents, she paused. Then she did something I did not expect. She turned to the judge and requested permission to play a short video. It was the student's documentary. The judge allowed it. And so, in front of everyone, including Karen, the board, and a room full of onlookers, my story unfolded once more. My hands hammering the dock, my words explaining the oyster shell reef project. The neighbors speaking of past joys and current fear. The old man holding the photograph of him and my father fishing. In better times, the room grew quiet. No one looked away. Not even Karen when it ended. Celia turned to the judge. "We are not here today because Mr. Shaw broke any laws," she said. "We are here because he refused to be broken by intimidation. Because he chose to defend what was his. Not in anger, but with integrity." The judge leaned back slightly, folding her hands over her notes. She asked only a few questions, sharp, specific, and aimed like arrows. To Karen's lawyer, "Show me where in the law your client's association has jurisdiction over private land." To Celia, "Did the county verify the reef project's permit?" To me, "Have you responded with aggression at any point during this conflict?" And when all the questions were answered, she said the words we had waited months to hear. "I find no evidence that Mr. Shaw has violated any statute, regulation, or civil code. The land in question is his, legally and historically. The HOA has no governing authority over it. Furthermore, I find that the plaintiff's actions, including the online defamation and use of edited footage, constitute harassment and Walkley. And Walkley's to cease harassment and Walkley's. And Walkley's sees the luxurious texture that glides on smoothly and leaves a rich, long-lasting color. Walkley's/extra, my Walkley's/elapse, Walkley's/elapse, meet Macau's loss. Walkley's/quia, my Walkley's, my Walkley's, by Weepy Wee Seeps. We see to you to see we lie with le I see I get it sit good to I sits a be sits we desal see kui kasa sits latest six but we with sits it use it live to the cups sit this but I an abuse of community influence. Case dismissed. And Mr. Shaw's counterclaim for legal damages may proceed. There was no applause, no eruption of celebration, just the sound of breath releasing across the courtroom, the kind of breath you hold when you are afraid to hope. Karen's shoulders dropped. Her eyes widened for only a second before she turned away, reaching for her bag as if the defeat was something she could hide behind leather straps and force dignity. Outside, reporters waited. Not the kind with viral agendas, but local ones, who had followed the story from the beginning. I answered a few questions, short and respectful, but I did not gloat. This had never been about winning. It had been about keeping something sacred safe from people who tried to rewrite rules to suit their control. And in that moment, I felt something deeper than victory. I felt peace. That night, the beach was silent again. Not because people feared Karen, but because they no longer needed to whisper. I lit the fire pit and sat with the same neighbors who had once stood back in silence. They laughed now, shared stories, played old folk songs on out-tuned guitars. The sand was still the same. But the fear that had once clung to it like fog was gone. Karen, I later heard, stepped down from the HOA board. She cited health reasons, but everyone knew the truth. She had built her power on fear and control, and when that crumbled, she had nothing left to stand on. The dock stood strong. The cabin stood proud. And I stood not as a man who fought for land, but as someone who refused to let false authority silence something real. But the journey was not quite over, because a letter came in the mail the next day, and it was not from Karen. It was from someone I had not heard from in a long time, and it would change everything once more. The morning after the trial felt like a rebirth. The ocean's rhythm was gentler somehow, as though it too had been waiting for a verdict. The cabin was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that sings no tension, no anxiety, just the low hum of peace echoing through the old wooden beams. I sat on the steps with a hot mug of coffee, listening to the tide wash in and out, the waves carrying away what months of legal war had left behind. It was a strange thing, feeling both weightless and grounded. The land was mine again, fully and finally. But I was no longer the man who first arrived here, broken and angry, holding on to a deed like it was a lifeline, but just as I was beginning to believe that my chapter with the past had closed, the letter came. It was tucked among the usual pile of flyers and mailers, almost forgettable in its plainness. No return address, just my name, written in an unfamiliar but steady hand. I opened it slowly, curious but cautious, expecting perhaps a thank you or a neighbor's reflection on the trial. But what I read inside made the world pause. Dear Mr. Shaw, I believe we are family, though we have never met. My name is Rachel, and I am the daughter of your Uncle Paul, your father's younger brother. Understand this may come as a surprise, but I have followed your recent story through the news and felt compelled to reach out. Not to disrupt, but to reconnect. My father passed away many years ago. He used to tell stories of this beach, of you as a boy, of the cabin and the dock and the long summers filled with fishing and laughter. He left us with nothing but memories and a box of old photos and one letter. A letter he wrote, but never sent. In it, he expressed his regret for losing touch with the family and his hope that someday someone would come back to the shoreline and restore what mattered most. That someone, it seems, was you. I have no claim to the land. I want nothing but to visit, if that is ever something you would allow. To walk where our fathers walked. to hear the wind through the same grasses, to stand where they once stood, and perhaps to share a story or two, not from obligation, but from a shared history neither of us should forget. With kindness, Rachel. For a long while, I could not move. The letter in my hand weighed more than any legal paper Karen had ever filed. It was not heavy with conflict. It was heavy with meaning. In the middle of a battle for land and truth, I had forgotten what this beach truly was. It was not just soil and sand and property lines. It was a memory passed between generations, an inheritance that carried more than ownership. It carried connection. It carried blood. Okay? And it carried the power to heal, if you let it. That weekend, I wrote back. I told Rachel she was welcome anytime, and that when she arrived, she would not find a stranger waiting. She would find family. A few days later, she came. She was tall, soft-spoken, with the same gray eyes my father had. She brought with her that box of old photos, and we spent the entire afternoon on the porch, flipping through them, black and white pictures of a simpler time. Kids with scraped knees, old fishing poles, sunburned smiles. And in one photo, my father and her father standing on the dock, arms around each other, holding up the biggest catch of the summer. Like two kings of the sea, we laughed. We cried. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt whole again. Word spread quickly that a new relative had arrived. And to my surprise, many of the neighbors, even a few former HOA loyalists, came down to say hello. They brought pie, stories, music. They stayed long after sunset. The beach transformed that night, no longer a place of battle, but a place of reunion. Even Karen's house sat dark and quiet. I had not seen her since the court ruling, and truthfully, I did not expect to. But as the fire crackled and voices drifted into the sky like smoke, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. It was her. No longer the towering Karen who ruled with clipped words and HOA codes, but a woman standing still, watching something she could no longer control. I did not call her over. I did not offer a seat, but I nodded, just once, and in the stillness of the moment, she nodded back. Sometimes peace is not declared. Sometimes it arrives quietly when nothing more can be said. The seasons passed, and the beach lived on. The reef we had planted began to grow. Birds nested. Wildflowers returned. And my cabin became more than a retreat. It became a symbol. A living testimony that land, when defended with heart, can resist even the fiercest storm. 1 year later, I hosted a community gathering. Not a protest, not a legal statement. Just a celebration. We called it The Shore Remembers. People brought stories, recipes, poems written by their children. I shared the photo of my father and uncle, the one Rachel had given me, and told everyone about the letter that reconnected our bloodline. It was no longer just my story. It was everyone's. The land remained untouched by the HOA. Karen, from what I heard, eventually sold her home and moved inland. The board restructured. And though the bylaws still existed, they were now guided by one core principle: listen before you rule. As for me, I stayed. The tide still kissed the dock every morning. The gulls still cried over the waves. But now, they did so not over conflict, but over a legacy restored. Because, in the end, it was never about rules or fights or proving who was right. It was about honoring what matters: family, truth, peace, and the sacred stretch of sand that will always belong to memory.